Welcome back, deep divers, ready to explore how we think about the future.
Absolutely. It's a fascinating area, and today we're diving into something particularly intriguing, the connection between gender and how we picture what's ahead.
And how that, in turn, shapes what motivates us, right?
Exactly. We'll be unpacking a really comprehensive review article called Gender and Orientations Toward the Future. Links to Motivation by Barbara A. Green and Teresa K. DeBacker.
I was just looking at this article. It's pretty
Oh,
dense.
it is. It really synthesizes a lot of research. It looks at it from 5 different theoretical perspectives on how we see our future selves and how that impacts what we're driven to do.
5 different lenses to look through, huh? Okay, so what's the mission for today's deep dive? What do we want our listeners to walk away understanding?
I'd say our goal is to help you understand how your own gender, and when we talk about gender here, we're looking at potential patterns, not rigid rules, might influence how you see what's to come, and how that, in turn, might shape what motivates you.
Right, not about saying all men do this or all women do that, but more like, hey, are there any trends we can spot? And if so, where might they come from?
Precisely. And the review kicks off by looking at some of the early research on achievement motivation and gender.
Okay, back to basics.
Right. Think about Atkinson's model, which basically proposed that our motivation to succeed hinges on 3 things.
Yep.
Our desire for success, our belief that we can actually achieve it, and how much we actually value that success.
Makes sense. If you don't care about succeeding, you're probably not going to be that motivated to actually put in the work.
Exactly. And it also looked at the other side of that coin, the motivation to avoid failure, which is influenced by how much we fear failing and how bad we think that failure would feel. So you got this push and pull between seeking success and avoiding failure.
Right, those classic motivators. And if I recall, some of those initial studies back in the 50s kind of painted a picture of women just not being as driven to achieve as men. Like, when encouraged, men's desire for success scores went up, but women's didn't. So the assumption was women just have lower achievement motivation, period.
Yeah, that's what those early findings seemed to suggest. But as more research emerged, that perspective started to shift.
It always does, right? Nuance creeps in.
It really does, and it makes the picture so much richer.
Mm.
For example, there's this 1963 study by Lesser and colleagues. They made a really interesting observation. When they changed the scenarios used to measure achievement motivation, so they featured women instead of men, the achievement motivation scores of high-achieving female students actually went up.
Huh. So it wasn't that women weren't motivated, but maybe the way they were being measured wasn't tapping into the right things.
Exactly. And a key insight there is that motivation isn't always this fixed thing. It can be influenced by who we see as successful and who we identify with.
Makes sense. If all the successful figures you see are men and you're a young woman, you might not feel as fired up to achieve on those specific measures.
Right. And then you've got Horner's work in the 70s on the motive to avoid success, which added another layer of complexity to this whole understanding.
Ah, yes, Horner, that was a big one.
It was. She proposed that some women might actually fear success, and her research actually found evidence to support that. Women reported greater fear of success than men did. And even more interesting, in competitive situations against men, women who showed this fear of success actually performed worse than those who didn't.
Wow, so not just a lack of drive, but a potential fear of the consequences of succeeding, especially in a competitive context. It's like that old saying, be careful what you wish for.
Exactly. It highlights how social anxieties can actually directly impede achievement, and it seemed particularly relevant for women in those competitive scenarios. So not necessarily a lack of wanting to succeed, but maybe a fear of the social repercussions of doing so.
Such a powerful insight, right? It's not always as simple as who wants it more. These underlying societal anxieties can really influence our drive to go after things. What else did they find in those early days about gender and what people were striving for?
Well, there's this 1964 study by Aston and Nichols who looked at high-achieving students and found some differences in what their long-term goals were. Men tended to be more drawn towards careers in science and technology, were more focused on things like prestige, and they expected higher incomes.
The classic image of success, right?
It was. And this was the 60s, remember? Women, on the other hand, placed a greater emphasis on personal comfort and altruism, the desire to help others. So already you're seeing these different flavors of what a successful future looks like.
Right, like different visions of what a good life actually means. And again, probably reflecting the dominant societal roles of the time, right?
Exactly. It's a snapshot of how societal expectations were shaping aspirations. But the question is, did those trends stay the same over time?
Right. Good question. Did things evolve as society changed?
Well, that's where Fiorentine's longitudinal study comes in. He followed a group of college freshmen from 1969 to 1984 and observed a really interesting trend. There was an increasing convergence in values between men and women over time.
Oh, interesting. So they started to become more similar in what they valued.
They did. Women increasingly valued things like status, recognition, and authority, things that were traditionally more associated with men's ambitions. But their emphasis on altruism didn't go away. It was more like they added those other values to the mix.
More of a both hands situation rather than either.
Exactly. And what's really interesting is that women's educational and career goals actually shifted to align with these changing values. So as their values evolved, so did their ambitions. And overall, both men and women showed a stronger alignment between their values and their future plans by the mid-'80s.
So as society opened up more possibilities for women, their aspirations expanded as well. It's almost like they were finally allowed to want those things too.
That's a really good point. And it underscores how those early studies highlight that achievement motivation, especially for women, was very much intertwined with those prevailing societal roles. Their future visions involve this interesting blend of ambition, concern for others, and a desire for personal well-being, maybe with a more diverse range of goals compared to men at the time.
It paints a complex picture, right? It's not just about who's more ambitious, but also about how societal expectations and opportunities shape what we're even allowed to aspire to.
Exactly. And that sets the stage for how later research approached the future more directly through the concepts of future time orientation, FTO, and future time perspective, FTP.
Okay, so we're getting into the nitty-gritty of how we think about the future now.
We are. And while those two terms, FTO and FTP, often get used interchangeably, there are some subtle distinctions.
I love distinctions. Tell me more.
So Husman and Lenz, back in 1999, defined FTP as how people think about the future. This includes things like how far ahead they plan, the content of those plans, what they're actually thinking about, and how realistic those plans seem.
So not just what you want, but how you think about getting there.
Exactly. And they linked this FTP to two crucial things: goal setting and something called perceived instrumentality.
Perceived instrumentality. That sounds important. Break that down for me.
It is. It's that feeling that your current actions are actually relevant and will help you reach those future goals you care about. Like, if you're studying hard for an exam because you see it as a stepping stone towards your dream career, that's high perceived instrumentality. You see a direct connection between what you're doing now and that future outcome you desire.
Got it. So that sense of this matters for later. Like, I'm not just spinning my wheels here. This is actually leading somewhere.
Precisely. And a lack of perceived instrumentality can be a real motivation killer. If you don't see how your present efforts are going to pay off down the line, it's easy to lose steam.
Makes total sense. Okay, so FTP is about the thinking part of our future orientation. What about FTO?
Right? FTO, as defined by Yesme in 1996, is more about a stable personality characteristic, a general tendency to be oriented towards the future. This includes things like being able to anticipate what might happen, understanding the consequences of actions, and how much someone engages in planning and thinking ahead.
So some people are just naturally more future-focused than others.
It seems that way. But here's the thing. In a lot of the research, FTP and FTO are treated as essentially the same thing, the degree to which a person focuses on and values the future. It's more about how much the future matters to you, regardless of whether that's a temporary state or a more enduring trait.
Okay, so the distinction might be a bit fuzzy in practice, but we've got a general sense now of what FTO-FTP is all about. What did the research find out about potential differences between men and women and across different cultures when it comes to this future orientation?
Well, Dujesme did a lot of work in this area in the late 70s and early 80s, and his research was really influential. He was interested in how FTO interacted with things like intellectual ability, achievement motives that drive to succeed versus the drive to avoid failure, and of course, gender.
Lots of moving parts there. What stood out?
So in one of his early studies in 1979, he found that girls actually scored higher on overall FTO than boys did. They also scored higher on specific aspects of FTO, like anticipation, the ability to foresee potential outcomes, and their focus on their future occupation.
Girls were more future-oriented. Interesting.
It is. And what was even more interesting was that for girls, their highest FTO scores were linked to a strong motivation for success and a low motivation to avoid failure.
So for young women, being future-oriented seemed to go hand in hand with being confident and driven to achieve.
Exactly. Like they were saying, I'm going places and I'm not afraid to go after what I want.
I love that. What about the boys in that study?
Well, boys also showed higher FTO when their motivation for success was high and their fear of failure was low. But what's interesting is that their next highest FPO scores were actually when both of those motivations were low.
Huh. So kind of like they were coasting, like whatever happens, happens.
That's one way to look at it.
Yeah.
And another key difference was that ability level, how well they performed on intellectual tasks, seemed to have a bigger impact on girls' FTO than boys. Girls with moderate ability had higher FTO than those with lower ability, suggesting that for girls, a sense of competence might be a real driver of their future orientation.
So feeling capable seems to fuel that future focus for girls. I can do this, so I'm going to make a plan and go for it.
Exactly. And then Jesme's 1983 study took things a step further and incorporated that concept of perceived instrumentality we talked about earlier.
Ah, so how relevant they felt their actions were for their future goals.
Precisely. And this is where things get even more fascinating. He found a really interesting three-way interaction between gender, ability, and FTO when it came to both the motivation to avoid failure and the motivation to seek success. So all those factors were playing off each other in really complex ways.
Okay, walk me through that. What did he find?
Well, girls who had both low FTO and low ability had the highest scores on the motive to avoid failure.
Yeah.
Makes sense, right? If you don't feel confident and you don't see the point of what you're doing, you're probably going to be more afraid of failing.
Makes sense. So what about the high achievers?
Well, the highest motivation to approach success was observed in boys of moderate ability and girls of high ability.
Huh. So the boys didn't have to be super high achieving to be really motivated to succeed?
Right, and that might tie back to those earlier findings about boys being more comfortable coasting a bit. But here's a really important takeaway. Perceived instrumentality seemed to impact motivation only for girls.
Wait, really? So boys' motivation wasn't affected by whether they saw their actions as relevant for their future goals?
That's what the study found. But for girls, if they were strongly motivated to succeed, that motivation got even stronger when they perceived their current schoolwork as being important for their future.
Wow, so for girls, seeing that direct connection between what they were doing now and what they wanted to achieve later was a huge motivator. Like, if I do this well, it will actually help me get to where I want to be.
Exactly. And his 1983 B study on worry and emotionality kind of supported this. Boys, again, seemed less influenced by how instrumental they perceived things to be. But girls, they reported experiencing more worry when they had lower perceived instrumentality. And girls who had both high FTO and high ability had the lowest worry scores.
So for girls, a clear vision of their future and a belief that their actions were actually moving them towards it seemed to offer a sense of security and reduce anxiety. Like, I'm on the right track so I can relax a bit.
Right, that's a great interpretation. And Jesme's 1981B research actually explored how gender influenced the perception of how far away a goal felt. Not the actual time distance, but how close or distant it felt psychologically.
Ah, so time can feel different depending on who you are.
It seems so. He found that for boys with high FTO, important goals that were close in time felt even closer. But for girls with high FTO, it was actually the opposite. Important goals that were further away in time felt closer to them.
Wow, that's really interesting. Almost like boys with a strong future focus are energized by those near-term rewards, while girls with that same strong focus are drawn to those bigger, more distant milestones.
I like that way of putting it. And all of this really underscores that we can't just talk about future orientation as a single thing. It's so multifaceted and influenced by who we are, what we value, and what we believe is possible.
Absolutely. And then Halvori and his colleagues took these ideas and applied them to the world of sports. Their research in the early to mid-90s focused on sport-related FTO.
Oh, yes, I remember those studies. Fascinating stuff.
So in a 1991 study, they found that when a goal was near in time, like an upcoming competition, the motivation to succeed was linked to better performance for both genders. Pretty straightforward, right?
Makes sense. The closer you are to the goal, the more that desire to succeed kicks in.
Exactly. But when the goal is further away, like a competition a year in the future, boys with high success motivation showed a positive link between their future time perspective and their actual performance. So the more future-oriented they were, the better they performed. But for girls, it was actually the opposite. They found a negative link between future time perspective and performance.
Wait, really? That's so counterintuitive. You'd think the more future-oriented you are, the better you do. regardless of gender.
You would, wouldn't you? But the researchers propose that this might have something to do with how girls handle longer-term pressure in a competitive environment. And they also found that as a goal approached, as the pressure increased, girls with high motivation to avoid failure tended to actually decrease their effort.
Oh, so like they were getting overwhelmed by the fear of not measuring up.
Exactly. And the boys in that same situation, they actually increased their effort as the goal got closer. So totally different ways of coping with that pressure.
Fascinating. So maybe girls are more prone to feeling the weight of those long-term expectations and it kind of paralyzes them, whereas boys ramp up their efforts to try and meet those expectations head on.
That's one interpretation. And then in 1996, Thomason and Halveri found that fear of failure was negatively linked to girls' overall involvement in sports. That connection wasn't there for boys. And they also found that boys who were involved in sports were less likely to see their academic tasks as relevant to their future, while no such link was found for girls.
So girls were more likely to maintain that sense of, I need to do well in school because it matters for my future, even if they were also heavily involved in sports.
Exactly. And it reinforces that idea we talked about earlier that women might be more inclined to see and pursue goals across multiple domains of their lives, not just one.
Right, not putting all their eggs in one basket, so to speak. So to sum up this whole section on Jesme and Halvari's work, it seems like perceived instrumentality, that sense of this is relevant for my future, might be a particularly powerful motivator for women. And girls might be more susceptible to the negative impacts of that fear of failure on their performance.
It's almost like they're more sensitive to the stakes involved, both positive and negative.
That's a good way to put it. And it's worth noting that a lot of this research was done in Western culture, so it's important to look beyond those contexts as well.
Right. We can't assume these findings apply universally. So what did they find when they looked at adolescents' future plans, hopes, and fears in different cultures?
Well, there's this 1976 study by Lamb and colleagues who looked at West German adolescents. They found that boys had a stronger focus on career, both in terms of how many career-related hopes and fears they expressed, and how far into the future they extended those hopes and fears. Girls, on the other hand, were more focused on family in both those aspects. But here's where it gets interesting. Middle-class girls actually showed a greater time extension for family than boys did. But the opposite was true for lower-class adolescents.
So class played a role as well.
It did. And the researchers speculated that lower-class young women might have been more optimistic because they were maybe less aware of the potential complexities of balancing work and family life.
Like they hadn't encountered those challenges yet, so they were more hopeful about being able to manage it all.
That's one interpretation. But another way to look at it is that they might have simply been more accepting of the likelihood that they would need to work and didn't necessarily see it as a conflict with family life. Their optimism could have been a practical adaptation to their anticipated reality.
Right, like this is just how it is, so I'm going to make the best of it.
Exactly. It highlights how future orientation isn't just about hopes and dreams, but also about navigating those anticipated life circumstances, which can vary greatly depending on your social and economic background.
So it's not just about what you want, but also about what you expect to happen and how you plan to deal with it.
Precisely. And Segener's work with Israeli adolescents in the late 80s also revealed some really interesting cultural and gender differences.
What did he find?
So in his 1988 study, he found that Jewish and Arab adolescents had different primary concerns about the future, and these concerns also varied by gender within those groups. For Israeli Jewish students, boys tended to focus more on things like military service, work, and career, while girls emphasized marriage, family, and caring for others.
Sounds pretty traditional.
It does. And interestingly, there wasn't a gender difference in how specific their goals were. Both boys and girls had clear ideas about what they wanted, but for Arab students, it was a bit different. Girls were more concerned with higher education, their own personal growth, and the well-being of others, while boys were more focused on broader community issues like politics and economics.
So different priorities depending on their cultural background.
Exactly. And within that Arab group, girls were more specific about their hopes for education and their fears about career and work, while boys were more specific about their anxieties related to politics and economics.
It's like they were attuned to different aspects of their future reality based on both their culture and their gender.
Precisely. And that's a crucial takeaway.
Mm-hmm.
Cultural context profoundly shapes what different groups and genders within those groups envision and worry about for their future. It's not just about individual preferences, but also about those broader social and cultural forces at play.
Right. So much of it is about the world we're embedded in and the messages we've received about what's expected of us.
Exactly. And a later study by Signer and Halabi Care in 1998, which compared Jewish and Druze adolescents in Israel, further illustrated this point. They found much more pronounced gender differences in the Druze sample, with girls focusing on marriage, family, and education hopes, but also having fears about career and work.
So, a mix of traditional aspirations and anxieties about balancing those traditional roles with career ambitions.
Right, it's not always a neat and tidy picture.
Yeah,
And boys in that Druze sample focused more on career and work hopes, but their fears were about community problems. So different concerns altogether.
different visions of what a good life looks like and what might threaten that vision.
Exactly. And they also found an interesting age interaction. Older Druze women became more focused on their future family and community, while older men actually focused more on higher education. So it's not always a linear trajectory either.
People's priorities can shift and evolve as they get older.
Absolutely. And in contrast to that Druze sample, the Jewish sample in that study showed much less stark gender differences in their future orientations. Their hopes and fears were more aligned with traditional gender roles, but those differences were less pronounced. And for both genders, older Jewish students were more preoccupied with those immediate transitional roles, things like finishing school, military service, and starting higher education.
So, a bit more focus on those near term milestones, those stepping stones into adulthood.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder if, as societies evolve, those traditional, very gendered future orientations might start to become less rigid.
Like maybe as cultures become more westernized, some of those sharp lines might begin to blur a bit.
That's a really interesting hypothesis. And Sagander's 2000 study, while primarily looking at optimism and pessimism, did find that young men had a much stronger future orientation when it came to exploring and committing to military service, and this was linked to higher social optimism.
So, being future oriented in that very specific domain was beneficial for them.
It was. And it highlights how those specific cultural institutions can really shape our future focus in gendered ways. Like, in that Israeli context, military service is a really significant rite of passage for young men, so it makes sense that they'd be more future-oriented around that experience.
Right. It's not just about abstract future thinking, it's about what your culture tells you is important to plan for.
Exactly. And then you've got those fascinating cross-cultural studies, like Sundberg et al.'s work in 1983, which compared adolescents in Australia, America, and India.
Oh, yes. That one really highlighted how much culture can shape our future priorities. What stood out to you in that study?
Well, they found some really interesting interactions between culture and gender in terms of how far into the future people were projecting their hopes and fears, what they call time extension. Australian young women had the longest time extension among all the women in the study, and Australians in general looked further ahead than Americans did.
So, cultural differences and how much the future looms large, so to speak.
Exactly. And Indian young women actually had the shortest time extension overall, but Indian men had the longest time extension out of everyone in the study.
Wow, that's a big gender difference within the same culture.
It is. And it shows how we can't make assumptions based on gender alone. Culture plays a huge role as well. And they also found that Western men were more focused on acquiring things, possessions, status, and so on, while Western women were more focused on autonomy, independence, self-reliance, making their own choices.
That aligns with those classic Western ideals, right? Men as providers, women as free spirits.
Exactly. But in India, autonomy wasn't a major concern for either gender, which the researchers linked to the cultural norm of staying closer to home and family throughout life.
So, different values leading to different future priorities.
Exactly. And Nurmi and his colleagues also did a lot of great cross-cultural work in this area. Their 1994 study compared Australian and Finnish youth and found that girls in both cultures had more goals related to occupation and family, while boys had more leisure and property goals.
Sounds familiar, right? That blend of career and family aspirations for women.
It does. And Finnish girls also report the most concerns about their future education out of all the groups. And girls in both cultures were more worried about their future occupation than boys were.
So, even across cultures, you see those anxieties about career and family cropping up for women.
It seems to be a recurring theme. And their 1995 study, which also included Israeli youth, looked specifically at how much they explored and committed to their educational pathways. They found that Israeli youth showed the biggest gender differences in both exploration and commitment, with girls being much higher on both. Australian youth showed the next biggest differences, and then Finnish youth had the smallest gender differences.
So the cultural context really matters in terms of how much freedom and encouragement young women are given to explore different educational paths.
Exactly. And across all three cultures, women showed higher levels of exploration and commitment to education compared to men. And Finnish and Israeli women also expressed more hopes and concerns about their future education. So it's not just about having the opportunity, it's also about feeling the weight of those expectations and anxieties.
It's like they're carrying a heavier mental load when it comes to education, even if they're performing well.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And Nurmi's 1987 study within Finland actually looked at how the emotional climate in families influenced high school students' future orientation. He found that older girls, regardless of what the emotional climate was like at home, tended to have more hopes for their relationships with their parents and more detailed plans for their future families. They also had a higher fear of war than the boys did.
So those interpersonal connections and global anxieties were top of mind for them.
They were. For boys, having a positive emotional climate at home was actually linked to fewer fears about their future profession. And younger boys had a more negative outlook on their future emotions than girls of the same age did. And these sex differences actually became more pronounced as they got older.
So over time, boys became more optimistic about their future feelings, while girls' anxieties about relationships, family, and even global issues might have increased.
That's one interpretation.
Yeah.
And then Nurmi and Pulliainen in 1991 looked at the role of parental behavior, specifically family discussions versus authoritarian control, and how that related to future orientation. They found that more frequent family discussions were linked to stronger hopes for a future family for both genders, although girls reported these hopes more often than boys did.
So open communication seems to foster those aspirations for family life.
It does. And girls also had more leisure-related hopes in that study. Boys, on the other hand, showed a longer future time extension. They were thinking further ahead, and this was actually positively correlated with how much parental control they experienced. But that link wasn't there for girls.
So for boys, having stricter parents might have actually made them think more about their long-term future, but that wasn't the case for girls.
It's an interesting finding. It makes you wonder if boys maybe need that external structure to push them towards future planning, whereas girls are perhaps more internally motivated to think about what's ahead.
That's one way to look at it. And just to round out this section on Nurmi's work, his 2002 study with Samela Aro looked at young Finnish adults who were transitioning from school to work, and they found only one gender difference. Men's self-related goals were linked to their prior experiences with unemployment, while women's self-related goals were linked to their prior experiences with underemployment.
So for men, it was about being out of work completely, while for women, it was about not having work that matched their skills and aspirations.
Exactly. And it suggests that those recent labor market experiences might shape our future self-perceptions in different ways, depending on our gender. Like, if you've been struggling to find work that you feel good about, it might make you question your own abilities and what you're capable of achieving.
Absolutely. And it's a good reminder that our future orientation isn't just about some abstract set of hopes and dreams, but it's very much rooted in our real-world experiences.
Right. Those experiences shape our beliefs about what's possible and what we deserve. And Green's 1990 study and her 1992 study with Wheatley, both looking at high school and college students in the U.S., also added some really interesting insights to this whole picture.
What did they find?
So Green's 1990 study found no overall gender difference in the sheer number of future events that people expected to happen in their lives, but men tended to project further into the future, and they had a more even distribution of those events across their lifespan.
So a longer time horizon and a more spread out vision of their future.
Exactly. Women, on the other hand, were equally focused on professional and material achievement as men were, but they were more likely to anticipate taking career breaks to raise children. And by late adolescence, both genders were showing more similar life course expectations, aligning with those dominant cultural norms.
Like they were starting to internalize those societal scripts about what a normal life trajectory looks like.
Exactly. And Green and Wheatley's 1992 study found that college men also extended further into the future than women did. Women reported anticipating more family-related events, and they expected major adult transitions, things like finishing school, starting a career, getting married, having kids to happen closer together in time.
So a more compressed timeline for those major life events.
Exactly. And what's really interesting is that for women, having a longer time extension into the distant future was actually linked to better reasoning ability and lower levels of current distress.
So having a broader perspective might actually be protective for women. Like if they can see those future possibilities more clearly, it might buffer them against some of those anxieties about meeting all those expectations.
That's one way to look at it. And men, in contrast to women, tended to anticipate getting a job right after finishing their education, then getting married, and then having kids even later. So, a more spread out sequence than what women envisioned. And the researchers actually suggested that women's higher levels of reported distress might be linked to this perceived pressure to achieve all these major life goals within a shorter time frame.
Like they're on a faster track with less room for detours or delays.
Exactly. It really highlights a potential gender difference in how we perceive the pacing and sequencing of those big life events. And to sum up all of this research on future time orientation and perspective, it seems like the overarching message is that culture plays a massive role in shaping how we think about what's to come. Women often have more diverse future content in their plans. They're juggling more balls, so to speak, but men might have fewer goals that are spread out over a longer perceived time frame.
Right, like they're playing a longer game with fewer moves but bigger stakes.
That's a great analogy. And it makes you wonder if there are potential benefits for both approaches. Maybe men could benefit from broadening their horizons a bit, exploring more diverse goals and interests. And maybe women could benefit from giving themselves more time and space to achieve those goals, easing up on that pressure to do it all in a shorter time frame.
That's a really insightful way to frame it. It's not about saying one approach is better than the other, but rather about recognizing the potential strengths and limitations of each and seeing how we can learn from each other.
Exactly. And speaking of different ways of approaching the future, the review article then shifts gears and dives into the concept of possible selves, which was developed by Marcus and Nurius back in 1986.
Ah, yes, possible selves. This is such a fascinating area of research.
It really is. It's all about those mental images we have of our future selves, the people we hope to become, and also the people we're afraid of becoming. And these imagined selves are thought to be really powerful motivators for our current behavior.
It's like having an internal vision board, right?
Mm,
Both the inspiring images and those cautionary tales that push us to make certain choices.
exactly. And Knox et al., in their 2000 study, looked at gender differences in these hoped for and feared possible selves among high school students. And what's interesting is that they didn't find any difference in the overall number of possible selves that boys and girls reported.
So both genders were equally capable of imagining different versions of their future selves.
Exactly. But girls rated their hoped for selves